I'm very thrilled, I must say, or delighted to see so many of you returning after the break. It might have been very good to have the coffee served in a room with only exits towards this room. But anyhow, I think that's also testament to the interesting character of the seminar. My name, as I said before, is Fredrik Uggla. I'm the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies. 1/3 of the co-hosts of this event. Let me also do some publicity regarding our institute. Most of you know about that, but we have a series of open seminars, many of which are related to development issues in Latin America, and they can be found on our webpage. Enough about that. Now, for you to ask questions. We already had Professor Kanga's excellent comments on the two presentations, but now it's really for anybody here who would like to ask questions for two participants. And then we'll follow the broader panel to discuss these things. Please, Åsa.
I wonder if the reduction of inequalities has anything to do with a better situation for the women on the labor market, or is it parallel to the men's?
Thank you very much. I think that perspective has to be emphasized perhaps in the presentation. To what extent is there a gender difference here, both in terms of labor market participation and on distribution of benefits? Would you like to start and then Amanda on that? And then
just again a very quick comment, and also the health warning that Latin America is a big place, and there are differences across countries. But we're discussing that in the coffee break, and it is part of the improvement and part of the reduction in inequality. The clearest kind of indication that I have come across is in a paper that was done by Chico Ferreira and colleagues on inequality reduction in Brazil, because they were able to identify changes in labor earnings that were due to changes in the demand and supply of workers, and also to control for the education level, the human capital level of different types of workers. And they identified three kind of areas: the reduction in the earnings gap between men and women, the reduction in the earnings gap between rural and urban workers, and the reduction in earnings gap by ethnic origin, as kind of already was shown by Luis Enrique. And I think that is quite good, because then what we're discussing there is a reduction in discrimination in pay. Pure discrimination in pay, and that is interesting. At the same time, there has been an increase in labor force participation of women in the region. It's nowhere near where it should be. We're still looking at the kind of 30s, lower 30s, and it should be really much higher than that. But that I could say in response to your question.
Luis Enrique, would you like to add to?
Yes, in these 20 years we observed a reduced inequality, better salaries for women, a reduced wage gap, as Armando said, which was considered in some publications as one of the most important drivers to decreased income inequality or earnings inequality. But what's more interesting, I didn't bring this data here, but the gap between men and women in terms of social security coverage in the Brazilian labor market has been closing as well. And today we have basically almost the same coverage for men and women. So the gap is closing for sure.
Sorry, can I add just one point that I forgot to mention? I was almost about, and then didn't, which is to say that the one element of public transfers, the human development or conditional cash transfer programs, in most countries in Latin America, they are paid to the mother. They are the direct recipients. So the transfers are kind of family-based, but this is the mother who receives them directly. And I'm sure that has made a difference too, in terms of perhaps inequalities in household income.
So I think we have a question over there, please.
Anja Wittmann from CESAR. I have a question about Brazil. Brazil has shown us that progress is possible, wealth is possible, everything has been so successful. 40 million people have been risen from poverty to something more acceptable and so forth. Yet, we hear now from time to time there are demonstrations everywhere in Brazil, complaining about the system, complaining about everything. How to understand this struggle from all the praise for Brazil and then now this dilemma? Is it political? Because the results you showed us are there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that question goes to Luis Enrique in the first place, and a short.
Yes. My best answer for it is I don't know. I really don't know how to explain it. The point is that, first of all, we have got a new group that emerged from poverty and are now demanding for better services as well. And this year, there is the situation is a little bit more complicated because it includes the problems with corruption in Petrobras and things like that. But overall, I think that the indications are very clear that we've gone through a period of increased prosperity, at least from the monetary point of view. Clearly, the situation is better in terms of access to services, but we still have to work a lot in terms of quality of services that the state delivers. So, if I can explain this in some way, I would go in that direction.
There is also the general proposition made already by Alexis de Tocqueville in The Old Regime and the French Revolution, that revolutions don't generally occur when people are badly off, but rather when they have gotten better off and then their expectations are suddenly dashed for one reason or the other. Would you like to add anything?
Just to add 2 points. The first point is that I think the demonstrations in 2014 are very different to demonstrations now. At least that is the kind of statistical evidence. For example, if you look at La Pop, they have been tracking, the kind of type of profile of demonstrators, and I think that the early demonstrations were much more broad-based. These ones are more kind of restricted in terms of the sector of the population that participate. I would have thought this is a good thing. Perhaps I'm sort of going back to my youth here, but I think demonstrations are never a bad thing. It seems to me that the reasons why you have high levels of demonstration in Brazil is because there is much greater demand on the part of the population as regard the quality of the services that they are receiving. Brazil collects something like 36% of GDP in taxes, which is at the level of Portugal or Spain, probably higher than Portugal and Spain. So there is a natural, it's natural that people will require that kind of service provision will improve. And on that level, the Brazilian government has some way to go in terms of improving services.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two questions more. We have Jan, and then please over there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's been a lot of attention lately in Europe and Sweden towards a book. I said that there has been a lot of attention lately in Europe and Sweden towards a book by the French economist Thomas Piketty called Capital in the 20th Century. In a way, he is quite pessimistic about the reasons for lack of inequality, stating that it's mainly related to the two world wars. that caused the destruction of capital, which decreased inequality. And you have a more optimistic view, and you may of course also state that Latin America didn't get involved so much in the war, so that's maybe the reason for the higher levels of inequality. But I wonder if there has been some discussion about the conclusions of Mr. Piketty in Latin America, and to what extent you feel that his analysis is applicable for Latin American conditions, and if not, why so?
Thank you. We will take two more questions here at the same time, and then we'll give the word back to the presenters. Please.
My question is, do we hear a temporary halt in social development and economic development in Latin America, or is it a paradigm shift going on in Latin America in this moment? And we were referred to the French Revolution and developments in Brazil. Are they sort of occasions when history will change? Is that what we see in Latin America in this moment? Thank you.
Thank you. And to Rickard.
Rickard, you didn't talk much about the tax system. You talked about social security and benefits. That's part of the government policy. But we have in our developed countries with development an increase in tax levels and also an increase in progressivity, well, up until now or some decades ago. Has that happened to any extent in your countries? An increase in tax levels out of GDP and an increase in progressivity?
So, thank you. With that, we'll give the word back to presenters. Armando, would you like to start?
Yes, thanks a lot. The question about Piketty and the question about tax, and perhaps the question about whether this is a permanent or a temporary shift, I'm going to try to kind of provide some kind of answer looking at the, drawing a comparison between the kind of tax system that you have in Sweden and the kind of tax system that Latin Americans have. In Latin America, most of the tax collection comes from either consumption taxes or natural resource revenue taxation. And over the last kind of 15 or 20 years or so, that has deepened even further. Now, that means, therefore, that we have very little progressive taxation. Overall, for the region in Latin America, the contribution to governments from personal income tax is around 1% of GDP. 1% of GDP, and so only the top 30% of the population actually pays personal income tax. So the majority of taxation comes from consumption taxes. Now, if you consider, for example, Brazil, then you have a really flat tax system. Perhaps the poorest pay more tax as a proportion of their income than the rich. It's about 25%. Move towards the richer part of the population, again, it's about 20–25%. I'm excluding here corporate taxation, so it's just the household taxation, as it were. So that is the kind of structure of taxes. So the main resources for governments in the recent recent policy innovation have come from natural resource revenues, as in the case of Bolivia, for example, and kind of increases or expansion of consumption taxes in the case of Brazil. Now, the question is, should Latin American governments introduce progressive taxation? Perhaps it's not feasible, right? Some commentators argue that the reason why Latin America personal income tax goes back to the colonial times, where the Spanish came in and wanted to kind of get all the resources out of the country. But I'm not so sure about that. I think it's unlikely. There is in recent times that has expanded personal income tax Uruguay, and that is really minute kind of revenue collection. So I think for the foreseeable future, we have to live with the form of tax revenues that we have. The question is how you use those tax revenues to introduce progressivity on the expenditure side. Perhaps Latin America shouldn't worry so much about where the taxes come from, but really worry very much about how they are spent. And then progressivity on that side. That is also a problem with Piketty, because although I think Piketty may apply to Latin American countries, his conclusions, which are to strengthen personal income tax, I don't think they're feasible in a Latin American context. So I'm not really sure that is the case. Now, the last question was about whether it's permanent or temporary. On the issue of taxation, I think we need to pay attention in Latin America to fiscal inclusion. Poor people pay taxes. As I said, most Latin American countries have really flat tax systems, so that the rich pay as much as a proportion of their income as the poor. And that has the advantage of then generating fiscal inclusion. One of the reasons why you have political support for programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil is because even the poorest pay taxes and they kind of provide some services. That perhaps is a measure of whether the current changes are permanent or not. I would have thought that given the tax systems, given fiscal policies in Latin American countries, given fiscal inclusion, it's going to be really hard to change that.
Okay. Well, as a member of the Brazilian government, the public service, I have to believe that we have a tendency, at least, to a more progressive tax. It does not make sense for us to continue this way, but I have to agree in practical terms with Armando that it's very, very difficult to change the tax system in Brazil. There are too many stakeholders to be taken into account, and they have the political power to block the discussion, to stop that. Every time that a deep tax reform was planned to take place, it stopped, and we didn't have progress. But I think that in the long term, with cumulative effects of small changes in the tax system, we will have a more progressive or a minimally progressive tax system, since the current one is definitely not progressive.
Thank you.
Can I just one point, and that is in answer to Oli's comment about universalism and targeting. Because in Sweden you could say we're going to have universal transfers, but we collect the money back in person. That can't happen in Latin America because the majority of people do not pay personal income tax.
Now, I know there are other questions, but we have to move on to the final part of this, which is a panel. And for those of you who have, and I'm sure that there are many, I hope you can ask them afterwards or continue the discussion here. But with that, I'd like to invite the other members of this final panel, which is Palme, who is a professor at the Department of Government at Uppsala, a former director of the Institute of Future Studies, among other things, and has written on social policy in Sweden, and also very interested on the Nordic countries and Latin America. Torsten Wetterblad, who is partly from SIDA and partly from our Institute of Latin American Studies, who is also a development economist, has been with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, among other places, and currently works with social protection at SIDA and at the Institute. And Karin Mettell, who has worked at SIDA, but worked in the department and has previously worked with CIPU and other places. Please, if you come up, and we hope to broaden the discussion in this way. While you do so, let me also say that this, in case you wonder what the camera is doing there, it's actually for broadcasting this whole event and putting it up on the FUF webpage, the FUF webpage being f.se, where you will hopefully be able to event again, if you think that's or want to alert your friends or other persons who are interested in this. Now, thank you very much for the panel. I will directing a question particularly to Joachim and to Karin, who have the particular experience from other regions here. What transferability, what let's say applicability do you see of the discussion so far to more broader global truths about poverty reduction? And this obviously goes along with Professor Kanga's question on how well do ideas really travel here? Are there things that Latin America should learn or take into account? Latin America might be provided a different model, or are there things that other regions could take up from the experience we've heard here? Joachim, would you like to start on that?
Not a small issue to deal with. I think first of all, I think it's good to build on success. So if you have succeeded to promote a policy that is actually working, why not kind of political support? It's also, in my view, social policies become part of nation building. So I think that the conditional cash transfers in Brazil, Bolsa Família, is a good example of that. And also, I mean, it's clear that the idea has traveled very successfully, and not only in Latin America. So I think that ideas can travel. But I guess that you need to look at as also the sort of political economy of ideas, because it's clear that there have been strong also international supporters of the conditional cash transfers. So without the support of IDB or the World Bank, I don't think that we could have seen these programs fly the way they have done. So I think that you need to have sort of strong partners who can contribute to the sort of spreading and implementation of the ideas. There is also, in a way, striking similarity between the Latin American experience with poverty reduction in the past decade and what we've seen in Scandinavia, because it's a result of, at least when the Brazilian experience, it's a result of a combination of employment, high minimum wages, and then also, in addition, on top of that, cash transfers. And if you see look at the Swedish development here in the post-war period, it's been sort of based on the successful sort of structural transformation from an agricultural society, and minimum wages have been enough to sort of universal benefits have helped old people and families with children to get out of that. But it's not sort of been without investment and capital. And of course, Sweden have had the great advantage of having a universal education since 1842, but it's by labor market capital formation on the firm level to an extent that I think is very, very important for poverty reduction. So I think that there are some sort of interesting and maybe unexplored similarities between the Swedish experience and what we can see in Brazil. But of course, there's a big difference, and I was glad that we pointed to that the Latin American experience is that social policy has been for the established part of the society. And the problem has been to reach out to the informal sector, to the uncovered population part. And Sweden and Nordic countries could sort of build the system from below, which is, of course, much easier to do if you can sort of avoid all the already existing structures. But what I think is sort of the common challenge here is how to sort of build on these kinds of what some people say are institutional complementarity. policies aimed at providing decent wages, investment in human capital, and then cash benefits. And I think that this is, I think, maybe a possibility to create a new momentum for sort of social policy in Latin America. It may be that there are some limits to what you can achieve with Bolsa Familia time programs, but if it's possible to sort of reinvent this combination of human capital investment, formalization of the labor market, which has been important, and then, I mean, looking for the political coalitions, because this has, I think, been the great success of the Nordic model. It used to be built on a between the agriculture sector and the emerging industrial working class. It was then, in the post-war period, recreated as a coalition between the working class and the increasing salaried white-collar workers. And from the 1970s onwards, it's been again recreated as a coalition between the men and women, because the policies that have been implemented since the 1970s have clearly been directed at specifically these, combination of providing cash benefits but encouraging market work, so that a lot of the poverty reduction we see in Sweden, after that, has been about having two earners in a household, which is sort of what many other European countries have failed to recently. So I think that it's good to build on the success, look for what has been the successful, and I think that's the combination of different kinds of and how can we recreate that and form a broad political coalition behind that. It's not an easy thing, but I think this is why we should continue to exchange experiences with how we have reformed our not only social protection system, but education and labor market systems.
Thank you. First, I must say thanks for being invited to the panel. I think it was, I haven't worked with Latin America for the past or so this was a very welcoming review of what has happened. I worked with Latin America for about a decade along the millennium, the turn of the millennium. And the story that was presented here today is very different from the story that we lived in times. There was a lot of disappointment with democracy at the time. I remember we supported Latino Barometro, and there was really a doubt whether democracy could deliver for Latin Americans at that time. There was almost a call for going back to some of the more authoritarian rules, because they didn't feel that democracy delivered in terms of social services. So the story that we hear today is quite uplift actually for a lot of other countries. I know Latin America is a big story, varies to country, but in contrast to that, we have 8% in most of the sub-Saharan Africa, not most, but many. And so 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are in sub-Saharan Africa. And that does not translate into poverty reduction at all. And it's very puzzling how do you actually achieve it. So I think some of the lessons that we could learn is, of course, that policy matters. And I'd like to know if there is an epistemic shift that you talked about. Is this democracy delivering, or is this what happened, what came first? Or is this just the inverted U-curve? Those of you who are economists knows, is this just going back to less inequality as we predicted? I don't have the answer for that. But I think the main lesson that I took with me from this presentation is that it's not, of course, about market or institutions. It's about the interplay between market and institutions. And there has been an overbelief, I think, in market forces, of course, and perhaps there is even an overbelief in institutions today. I don't know. I'm a firm believer of institutions and the importance of them. But I think that's also what Joachim was saying, that it's the interplay between institutions. And sometimes you could get the impression that most of the policies in these Latin American cases had been about redistributive policies. And I'm sure that that's not all there is to the story, because for poverty reduction to happen, there has to be income coming to the household. It cannot just be redistributive policies. And one of the challenges is to actually make, how does that's growth, how does that employment happen? And it has a lot to do with stable conditions for investors, for a lot of the things that if you read a bit further, you can actually find them. And I think what we're struggling with in Africa today is actually to have that interplay between institutions and market and make that work for poor people. Thank you.
Now, you along with several others, have touched upon the issue of institutions and systems, and we talked about the social protection institution, the tax institutions, Joachim mentioned labor market institutions, and it's obviously true that a lot of the progress that we've seen are connected to institutions. Yet the current institutions are to a certain extent haven't been stress tested. They have not really gone through a period of a sustained declining growth. These have been good years for Latin America, and that positive cycles are now coming to an end. Now, with that perspective, it obviously begs the question if these institutions that have furthered social inclusion and decreased the poverty over the last decade, if they would be able to sustain that development during a period of lower growth. And with that, I'd like to ask the question: what institutional or, let's say, systemic deficiencies or needs do you see to continue the present development? And perhaps you can start with Torsten, who has yet to be given the word on that.
Well, I'll try to answer that question, but I'll also make a link to the question that was raised before, because I think there are links. I think there's a very positive development that has been described here during the afternoon, what sometimes is called the establishment of the social contract in Latin American society. I think this is a fact. There are much more political acceptance of the necessity of raising the poor in society, or giving them benefits that they didn't have before. One example I think was mentioned by Luis Urique before was that though there is a fairly big, or I would say a big economic crisis right now in Brazil, and also political crisis for that sake, still there is no political party, as far as I know, that are questioning Bolsa Familia, that wants to revert it or spend less on that kind of programs. And I think that, as far as I know, that's also the case in other Latin American countries, though in some countries the crises are not as big as it is in Brazil right now. But I think there are limits also to this social contract, and that is linked to the discussion before. And I think what hasn't been stressed enough in debate so far is, well, it's economy and its politics combined in a good way, but it's one hasn't stressed enough, I think, the necessity of a further economic growth to make this possible, because it's very clear if you listen and look at the Brazilian story that it was very much the labor market growth and the growth of salary that is a very important part of or explains a very important part of the success. And if Latin America don't manage to boost more its growth policies than it's done so far, I think there are quite big risks that one cannot sustain this development. And I'll try to make it more clear. I mean, for all economists and for all economy, productivity is important. And if one looks at the development of productivity in the manufacturing sector in Latin America, it's very low. It's better in the agriculture part of it that has been mentioned, but overall productivity gains or development in Latin America compared, for example, with the big success Asia is far behind. One uses too little of the national resources for investment, and one also trades too little in between Latin American countries than one ought to do. So a policy that boosts much more economic growth, I think, is necessary in order to sustain the policies that has been possible to manage so far.
Joachim, would you? Sorry, I think that the point of productivity here is crucial, and it goes along with what Joachim just mentioned on labor market training here. And does it not? Is it? This is still a deficiency, perhaps, in the Latin American model. The labor productivity, isn't it? Anybody who feels? Armando, would you?
Just a couple of comments. I think something that Joachim said and which was remarked in the form of a question. I think that real improvements in productivity require, in the Latin American context, a stronger kind of integration of women into employment and paid employment. Now, I think that is the point that Joachim was making, particularly if you look at northern countries, that is really one of the cornerstones of the real kind of way of addressing kind of inequality. I think that is just perhaps beginning. Perhaps Luis Enrique might say something about about the expansion of preschool education in Brazil. I think in most Latin American countries, certainly the Southern Cone countries, are looking at this issue in terms of facilitating women's employment through preschool education. It may be that preschool education also has advantages, intrinsic advantages in terms of children's kind of ability to learn from a very early age. So I think that might be kind of the way forward in terms of looking at that. But I think there is still quite a lot of that needs to be done in terms of a stronger integration of women into paid employment.
But does it not go beyond that? You could also say that this might call for a more active industrial policy. There was, I don't know how many of you read it, a couple of months ago in The Economist, which is hardly the paragon of, let's say, state-led industrialization, a column calling exactly for more of efforts to repeat the successes of the East Asian countries and having an active industrial policy, which is something we haven't touched upon. Well, but this would obviously imply a new development model, not just a new social model. Do you agree with that call? Do you think it's something that would be needed, a broader paradigm change rather than the social change that we see? Anybody on Luis Enrique?
I said before that we have experienced it during the 90s especially. We had achieved quite remarkable result in terms of access to government or state services, especially education. And if you look at the rate of access of people aged 3 to 4, 3 to 5, 6 to 14, 14 to 17 to education, it improved a lot during the 90s and the 2000s. It's a remarkable improvement in all these areas. And the access to tertiary education also improved. the main question continues to be the quality of these services. I think that the country is quite aware about what should be done, and obviously the federative structure in Brazil, which is totally present in most of our policies and especially important in education, keep it quite difficult to be done. Because you have to work with 27 different states and 5,570 different municipalities that have their own system of education, etc. Even so, the results are coming, maybe not at the pace that we would like to see, but the results are clearly coming, and obviously I agree with the considerations that market and social security or social protection working together are responsible for what we have seen in the last, especially in the last 10 years, 12 years. And I totally agree that it changed the atmosphere a lot, the political atmosphere. Previously to the 2000s, the expectancy was so low because Brazil has had struggled during the whole 80s and the whole 90s, and the results were so bad that the 2000s brought a totally different atmosphere. Obviously, that in a country with lots of problems like Brazil still has, things are not going to be solved immediately, but I still believe that what we need to have in the short term is to recover the conditions for solid economic growth that we had in a large part of the 2000s, and that jointly with some interventions in the labor market, and for instance, increasing the minimum wage above inflation, produced great result in terms of reducing poverty, reducing inequality, and giving a solid basis for keeping the revenue for some kinds of expenditures like the Bolsa Família program. It was not much present here, but I would like to address the point that while the demographic transition that countries like Brazil and several other Latin American countries will go through or are going through now, will have important consequences, and we should be prepared to it. The pace that demographic change has in these countries is something that was not experienced by other developed countries, the history of the developed countries. It's going fast, very fast, and probably be an old country much before getting rich. So we must be prepared for it, keeping social security expenditures under control. And I have to say that in Brazil, we are spending quite a lot of money for a relatively young country in social insurance especially. And at the same time, we have to increase the productivity of our labor force a lot to keep our heads above water in the last decades. That's it.
You're welcome.
I mean, first on institutions. I mean, I think that we could sort of say that. There's a value in predictable institutions as such. So insofar as the state can provide predictable context for both individuals and companies, I think this is for the better. then, I mean, we should be, of course, aware of the fact that we have to have the right incentives with our institutions. So, and I think here the sort of European experience is that you can have with properly designed social insurance programs, good incentives sort of built into the systems. And here, of course, there are some advantages with universal programs versus targeted, because it's easy to create poverty traps with targeted programs unless you're careful. I mean, more important, I think the whole issue about using the public sector for, I mean, having institutions that in human capital, and several of you have pointed to this, and I think the European experience suggests that talking about growth rates are a result of decades of differences in human capital investment. But I mean, also here it's about quality. But I mean, some countries, especially in Southeast Asia, have gone massively for investment in tertiary education. Maybe one could see some of the North African sort of political instability also as a result of sort of overinvestment in tertiary education. What the sort of Western European experience suggests is that the investment in secondary education, primary and secondary educations, are very important for growth. And so a balanced approach to sort of expansion of education is, in my view, perhaps the most important sort of institutional challenge ahead. But then about taxation, I mean, Brazil and some other Latin American countries have a taxation level on par with some of the European countries. So that shows it's possible to raise taxes. And then you have your own traditions of either using, like the Danes, income taxes almost exclusively, or combinations of different kinds of income sources. But I think that the diversification of tax revenue is probably the most important thing, and not to have income taxes, I think, would be very difficult if you want to expand a public commitment to investing in education that kinds of facilitate the labor force participation among women, etc. And then I think the issue is that you can't do things overnight. You have to take one step at a time. But also to understand that the tax systems can be redistributive even if you have flat tax systems. So the idea is that you can only achieve equality by having progressive tax systems is, I think, not correct. And then, of course, that is also politically difficult. But what also is economically efficient is taxation of property. You can have that without distorting incentives and so on, but that's a politically difficult issue, of course. But my sort of take on that is that you need to look for whatever tax you can find and not overstretch one specific tax source in order to sort of avoid creating incentive problems and the like.
Corinne?
It was just one point about institutions that I wanted to reinforce that was mentioned earlier, and I think it was the importance of having state institutions rather than government institutions, so that it's actually builds on a longer coalition of opinions, and I think that's a very important lesson, and it also has implications for example, donors of what kind of short-sighted policies can you support. It should be long-term. It should be country-owned, so to say.
We'll come back to the question of donor policy perhaps in the last moments. Dr. Torsten, please first.
No, I just wanted to on taxation and quality of public services, because there is a linkage that one sometimes forget talking about, especially talking about Latin America, which is a kind of dilemma, I would say. I mean, if you look at the tax GDP ratio in Latin America today, it's sort of reached more or less 30%, and it seems that it's flattening out. I mean, Brazil is an exception, but in general terms, this seems to be more or less what you can sort of tax, at least now. And there is a direct link to quality, and from a very special point of view. And I mean, duality of Latin American societies lead to that. I mean, now there seems to be political acceptance in a lot of countries of Latin America, from the middle class of paying taxes to finance public services for the lower classes that are mainly those that are using the public services, whilst the quality still not yet is that high that it's an alternative for a middle class person to put their children in a public school or use the public health services. And it's just when you reach that quality level that I think it's really possible to raise taxes. I mean, fundamentally, so that you actually have the possibility of expanding the public sector and the services, and creating more possibilities of going further when it comes to inequality. I think this is an important political dilemma that has existed for quite a long while in Latin America and still exists. Because, I mean, the middle class sometimes sort of resist both paying a better public service at the same time paying high bills for their private services when it comes to schooling and health.
Thank you. Now, we are concluding, but there's one final question that I think that a lot of us already ask ourselves, and that relates to what external actors, outside actors can contribute to this. Now, we've mentioned the IDB and the World Bank as important proponents of certain policy solutions. We've also seen that most of these positive developments are genuinely autochthonous, in the sense they're not driven by outside actors, but rather created by the countries themselves. At the same time, IDEA obviously is an outside actor. A lot of us have experience from working from SIDA and other actors. FUF is obviously an association that has been to a large extent driven by solidarity movement, and what can from here, from a Swedish perspective here. And I'd like to conclude the seminar, the panel, really about asking this question to all the panelists. Is there anything that outside actors can do to further these positive developments? And not in Brazil, then at least in Latin America, and if so, what role could outside actors, be they Sweden, be they IDEA or other international organizations, fill in continuing and sustaining these processes? Would you like to start?
Okay, thank you. Just a quick comment on trying to answer your question and not answering at the same time. Apologies. I think it's interesting in the context of the relation between Brazil and Africa, and perhaps Luis Enrique might say more on this, how the idea of South-to-South cooperation is taken over. I mean, more and more countries in the South are trying to transfer experience from one southern region to another southern region. The Brazilian government, for example, has Embrapa, which is an agricultural research institute, has about 6 offices in African countries. There is also quite a lot of cooperation and policy dialogue around social protection. So perhaps my point is this: that perhaps at the point where we're at now, what donors can do really usefully is to try to support South-to-South policy diffusion, cooperation, and knowledge exchange, because I think there is more of a chance for a country like Brazil to kind of influence policymakers in Africa than for Washington institutions to do so and get to an outcome that would be beneficial to them. So I think that would be my...
Very interesting. Corinne, that goes along with your previous...
Well, yeah, thank you. I think South-to-South cooperation is a good idea, and it's something that we actually did in Latin America. I remember we brought experts on taxation to Central America from Chile, from various countries, to actually bring about a discussion about how a fair tax system could look like. I don't know if we managed very well, because I think Guatemala still has 12% of GDP or something. But I think my main wish is that if we can somehow help to broaden the policy options that are favorable to the poor, I think that means a lot. If these ideas or these reforms would come from the South or from Sweden or from somewhere else, perhaps doesn't matter. But sometimes there is just a one solution fits all mentality that if you look at the example of Brazil or other countries, they haven't followed a straight path. They follow other development paths, and we don't know what works. So if there is any way that we as outsiders can bring in those experiences, I think that can make a change.
I mean, Brazil worked especially from the 2000s, work a lot on South-South cooperation. It's basically a direction that the government adopted since 2003. Personally, I think that we should be very careful with South-South cooperation and all the support that international organizations can give to this kind of cooperation to avoid making the same mistakes that we have made so many times before with North-South cooperation. Personally, when we are engaged with other governments to treat about the Bolsa Familia program, at least at the Ministry of Social Development, we try to emphasize a lot that we don't have a model that fits in our country or all different contexts. That Bolsa Familia is our experience, and that other countries must develop their own experiences. And it's inevitable for them. There is no safe path to get there, as occurred to us several times. We had quite difficult dialogues with the international organizations when we were designing the Bolsa Familia program. How to do that. And obviously, the discussion was difficult because they had that set of instructions about how to do the things, and I have to say we disagreed a lot with them and did it our own way, and that's I think it's the kind of respect that other countries deserve, and the Brazilian experience may be shared, but not in the same way of giving directions to other countries or showing them how to do. It does not make sense for us. I think it's sharing the experience, sharing the difficulties, trying to say that you don't need to make the same mistakes we made, but they will have to make their own decisions and to choose their own path. That's inevitable. So we should be very careful with the South-South cooperation for this kind of cooperation, not to repeat the same mistakes that we have seen with, for instance, North-South cooperation. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to add anything after that. I think that's sort of a very good way of summarizing what I think. It's about sharing experience and sort of opening up the world for different kinds of alternatives. But I think we should be aware of the fact that sort of there are very strong actors out there in the international organizations, not only the World Bank, but IMF and OECD and the European Union. And they're all trying to impose different kinds of agendas on countries that have, I mean, not only poor in terms of GDP, but also have modest resources. So I think that has to be we cannot only take a defensive position, but I really would like to stress the importance of sort of opening up the development agenda for choices. And I think also the advantage of Brazil now with its success, the advantages with some of the Nordic countries with some of its successes is that there's we can offer the opportunity to also share not only the successes but also the failures and the problems. And I think that there's an advantage in the sense that we have done in this part of the world the demographic transition. So we are in a way displaying one consequence of choices of development models. And Brazil is closer in terms of demographic development. So that's another way of sharing the future with, for example, the African continent. So I think that we should be very open-minded, but also recognize that there are very strong other development agendas which need to be not taken for granted, but that we can have alternatives.
I just wanted to come back and trying to conclude at the same time what was mentioned by Fredrik about the lack of understanding or discussion on the need of structural transformation of economies, or what could also be called a lack of understanding of the need of industrial policies. Industrial policies in Latin America has more or less been dead since the 90s and the Washington Consensus. But now it sort of seems like there are growing interest, and so there is a big need of it. And if we should share some of our experiences in the Scandinavian or sometimes, or maybe the European countries or economies, is that I think there is a broader understanding of the need of structural transformation of economies and acceptance of those structural changes, and using the state institutions to prepare oneself for those changes through a broad educational program. I mean, I think that's part of ought to be part of a growth agenda in Latin America that normally has been much more defensive, especially with the trade unions' position towards that. I think that kind of interchange of experiences and further understanding of the engines of change in economical in the economy, I think, is something that we ought to work with as well. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this, and on behalf of International IDEA, the Föreningen för utvecklingsfrågor, the Association for Development Issues, and the Institute of Latin American Studies, I'm very grateful for your participation, and for your participation. I think this has been the best of seminar in that it has answered a number of questions and posed even more questions perhaps, which is good, because then we can have more seminars and we will not get unemployed at research institutes or universities. So that's very good. So thank you very much for hosting this event, IDEA. Thank you for the initiative from FUF, and thank you to all the panelists for participation. Thank you.